This video is part 4 of my multi-part video series on the so-called phantom time hypothesis. If you are interested in the topic and have not yet seen my previous videos, I highly recommend you to check those out first, before watching this one. Otherwise, you may find it difficult to understand what I'm going to talk about here. Links to those videos will be in the description. Now let's begin. In my previous video about the topic, i.e. in part 3, I speculated that due to the phantom time inserted into our timeline, anomalies similar to what we have seen with the history of the Hungarians must have arisen with other peoples as well who were in contact with the Roman Empire, such as the Persians or the Arabs. I then speculated that it might be the case that the Parthian Empire and Sassanid Persia were actually the same thing, and the only difference between them is that the Roman sources called them Parthians and Persian sources called them Sassanids, and the 400-year gap between the two is simply the result of the phantom time. Originally, I did not plan to make a video about Persia through this lens for the simple reason that I'm not well versed enough in the Persian historical sources of that era in order to research the topic properly. However, after my video about the Hungarian Chronicles, a guy from Iran messaged me and he told me some pretty interesting things. Without him, this video would not have been possible. According to the historical science, the history of ancient Iran, or as they used to call it, Persia, looks something like this in a nutshell. After Alexander the Great defeated the last Achaemenid king, Darius, he conquered Persia. After his death, one of his generals, Seleucus Nicator, took control of most of the territory and founded the Seleucid Empire. Over time, the Seleucids began to decline, as a result of which several smaller Greek-led states emerged in the region. This decline is partly due to the invasion of the nomadic Parni or Parthians, who eventually defeated the Seleucids and these smaller states and conquered Persia, which then they ruled for over 400 years. Unfortunately, historians know very little about the decline and the fall of the Parthians due to the lack of sources, but the Parthians were eventually replaced by the Sassanid dynasty in the early 200s as the dominant power in the region when Ardashir I conquered Persia. The first thing that the Iranian guy told me, which piqued my interest, is that the Shahnameh, the Persian Book of Kings, says almost nothing about the Parthians, or as they are known in Iran, the Arsacids. The Shahnameh is the longest poem in the world. It consists of 50,000 couplets and tells us about the history of Persia in quite a lot of detail. The poet Ferdowsi wrote the work for 33 years until he finally managed to complete it in the year 1010. According to Iranian guy, Ferdowsi only writes about the Parthians in that he has heard about them, but during his research he did not find any writings or documents related to them. Ferdowsi writes in his work that when Alexander the Great died, multiple kings started ruling over Persia until Ardashir managed to conquer and unify the region once again. If my assumption is true, that the Parthians and the Sassanids are the same dynasty, that would explain this discrepancy. Unfortunately, the Shahnameh in its entirety has only been translated into English once, which happened 100 years ago and in 9 volumes, of which I could only find the first 4 online. Thus, I could not verify the claims about it, so I decided to read 2 other books about the history of ancient Persia. The first book was the University of Cambridge's work on Iranian history, more precisely, Volume 3, which is about the Seleucid, Parthian, and Sassanid period. I have to say, what I have read there seems to support my assumption. The following is written right at the very beginning of the book. I quote, "The remains of the long centuries of Parthian hegemony, whether epigraphic or archaeological, are dismally few. We are somewhat better informed about the Sasanian times, particularly the 3rd century, for which we possess a number of rock inscriptions and reliefs, notably those of Shapur I and the high priest Kartal, or Kurder. We have also ample written reports from both Iran and Byzantium for the later Sasanian period from Khusrau I onward. When I read this, it occurred to me that the aforementioned jump between the sources of the early and late Sassanid period might be due to the fact that the beginning and the end of the era stretched apart due to the added phantom time, and in reality, the Sassanid period might actually be a lot shorter than what we think today. I asked the Iranian guy about this, who said to me that the Shahnameh writes about 21 Sassanid kings, while academic history knows about 41. If Ferdowski's version is correct, it would support my previous suggestion that the official Sassanid history may be longer than it actually was. As for the lack of written Parthian sources, we can read the following lines further into the book. No Parthian poetry or work of literature survives in its original form from the Arsacid era. In fact, not a single book survives from pre-Islamic Iran. We know little about the recording of history in Parthian times, and no historical works are attributed to that epoch. In contrast to this, we know about written Sasanic records. The Book of the Cambridge University writes the following about them. We know of official records of royal deeds and pronouncements kept at the Sasanian court. Another interesting thing is that it seems that in the culture of the Sassanids, Alexander the Great played the role of a distinguished enemy, despite the fact that when Ardashir I ascended the throne, Alexander the Great had already been dead for more than half a millennium at that point. I quote, "The Sassanian attempt at taking advantage of the wounded feelings of the Iranians can be seen in the new dynasty's bitter propaganda against the Arsacids. It portrayed the Parthian state as a collection of petty principalities robbed of unity and strength, and as a creation of Alexander the Macedonian, who did not want to see Iran rise again." End of the quote. The way the Sassanid propaganda describes the Parthian Empire sounds much more like the Persia ruled by the Seleucids rather than the Parthians. An additional interesting fact is that it seems that not only the memory of Alexander the Great, but also the Greek language was strongly present in Persia during the Sassanid era, even though at that point, Greek rule was over for centuries. I quote, "When Shapur I wanted to record his victories over the Romans, he used in his renowned inscription at the Kaaba-i Zardusht not only Middle Persian and Parthian, but also Greek. Such was the prestige of the language some 400 years after the Seleucids had been driven out of Iran." End of the quote. As far as the Parthian language is concerned, there are relatively few sources written in it that survive to this day, but this is not what is interesting to us about the language. What's interesting is the fact that another name for Parthian is Northern Pahlavi. The Pahlavi language is the Middle Persian language, and it has a southern and a northern variant. The latter is often referred to as the language of the Parthians, which is quite strange because in theory, the Parthians are the Parni ethnic group, who are in theory a nomadic steppe people from Central Asia who eventually conquered Iran. So the language originally spoken by the Parni could not have been Persian, but should have most likely been some sort of Turanic language, yet historians attribute a Persian language to them. Even more strangely, the Parthians didn't write anything using this language attributed to them, but this is not even the most bizarre thing that I found, but the fact that the following sentence was written in the English Wikipedia article about the Parthian people. I quote, "There is no unambiguous evidence of the Parni in native Iranian language sources, and all references to these people come from Greek and Latin accounts." So basically, there is no evidence of the existence of the Parthians in the language they supposedly spoke, or in the area where they supposedly ruled for more than 400 years. But if the term Parthian does not originate from the term Parni, then where does it come from? Well, the Persians call themselves and their language Parsi. The term Parthian probably derives from this Parsi, so basically Parthian simply means Persian. By the way, despite the fact that in theory the Parthians spoke Persian, their coins bear mostly or entirely Greek inscriptions, and even these coins show a great similarity to the coins used by the Seleucids. I quote, "When the first Parthian king rose to power, his coins were struck after Seleucid models and imprinted with Greek legend. Mithridates' son, Phraates, in imitation of the Seleucid kings who had assumed divine status, styled himself on his coins Theopatoros, of divine descent. End of the quote. Both Mithridates and Phraates are considered Parthian kings, yet the coins minted by them look very similar to those minted by the Seleucids. So, in essence, Parthian history is a giant black hole. We know almost nothing about them apart from what the Greeks and Romans wrote, and not only are there no written sources from them, but there's also very little physical evidence attributed to them that has survived. By this we mean some statues, some jewelry, and a few buildings. It is particularly interesting that the book of the University of Cambridge claims that these archaeological findings attributed to the Parthians come exclusively from the edge of the empire, more precisely from Iraq and Syria, i.e., the provinces that were in direct contact with the Roman Empire, and which provinces came temporarily under Roman control. If you ask me, these archaeological finds were probably dated to the Parthian era by historians and not to the Sassanids, due to the area's connection to the antique Roman era where they were found. In those areas where this connection with Rome did not exist, the archaeological finds there could only be linked to the Sassanids, because quite simply, the Parthian Empire did not exist. More precisely, historians can't properly interpret and contextualize ancient Roman sources about the Persians due to the phantom time, and they think that the Sassanid and Parthian periods were different things. But if the Parthians and the Sassanids are really the same dynasty or empire, it means that there should be parallels in the history of these two political entities. The problem with this is that, as I explained earlier, due to the lack of sources, we do not really know much about the history of the Parthians. But let's work with what we know of. I found two events that I think are worth examining. The first is, of course, the Battle of Carrhae. For those who don't know, the Battle of Carrhae took place in 53 BCE, near the city of Carrhae, located in present-day Turkey, where the Roman legions led by Marcus Licinius Crassus clashed with a Parthian army led by a general named Serena. In the battle, the Roman legions suffered a crushing defeat. The leader of the Romans, Crassus, was captured by the Parthians, and he was executed by pouring molten gold down his throat, according to some sources at least. Another important piece of information for us is that the Romans were in alliance with the Armenian kingdom at that time. There was also a so-called Second Battle of Carrhae in 296, in which the Romans fought with their Armenian allies against the Sassanids. In this battle, the Romans also suffered a heavy defeat. Another parallel I found is that the Romans had an emperor named Publius Licinius Valerianus. According to some sources, Emperor Valerianus was defeated and captured in a battle by the Sassanids sometime around the year 260. The Sassanids then executed him by pouring molten gold down his throat. If I had to guess, I would say that the two battles of Carrhae and the deaths of Licinius Valerianus and Licinius Crassus are actually the same thing. The other such event is none other than the siege of the city of Ctesiphon, which the Roman Emperor Trajan managed to capture in 116 when he waged a war against the Persians, but he returned it to them a year later in 117 as part of a peace treaty. After that, the Romans besieged and occupied the city 5 more times, in 164, in 233, in 283, in 296, and in 627, but Ctesiphon always returned to the Persians in the end. So we can see that the two events associated with the Parthians, namely the Battle of Carrhae and the siege of Ctesiphon, appears later with the Sassanids as well, just as we would expect if we accept that there are problems with our timeline and that the two empires are actually the same. I was curious about what the Arab sources wrote about these two dynasties, so I read the part about the Parthians in the History of Prophets and Kings, which is a 40-volume compilation of the work of Tabari, a Muslim Persian scholar and historian who lived around the year 1000. It's interesting to note that while Tabari devotes an entire volume to the Sassanids, he writes about the Parthians, or as he calls them, the Ashkagans, in just a few pages. It seems that the chronological oddities regarding the period were apparent to him as well, because he writes the following on the very first page of Volume 5, which is about the Sassanids. I quote, "When there had elapsed, according to what the Christians and the possessors of the early scriptures relate, 523 years, but according to the Zoroastrians, 266 years, since Alexander had taken control of the land of Babylon, there arose Ardashir." End of the quote. Here again, just as we did with the Hungarian chronicles, we stumble upon the fact that an ethnic and cultural group assigns completely different dates to historical events associated with themselves than the historians who came from the Roman Christian world. Tabari explains these two different time intervals in the 4th volume in a little more detail at the part about the Parthians. More on that a bit later. Meanwhile, here's another quote. "The Arsacid kings were addressed as regional princes, and their rule lasted 266 years. Their reign lasted from Alexander to the rise of Ardashir, a total of some 266 years." End of the quote. The way Tabari describes the Parthian system, i.e., as a kind of petty king-vassal system, it is very similar to how the Seleucids ran the country. But let's look at what happens 266 years after Alexander the Great conquers Babylon, which happened in 330 BC. If we subtract 266 years from 330, we get 64. Does anything interesting happen in 64 BC? The answer is yes. Wikipedia writes the following for this year. King Antiochus XIII, Asiatisis, is deposed and killed by the Syrian chieftain Sampsiceramus. This is considered by some the end of the Seleucid dynasty. So, according to one version written in Tabari's work, the Parthian era ends exactly when the Seleucid era ends, according to some historians. The most likely reason for this is that Tabari is actually talking about the Seleucids here when he talks about the Arsacids, i.e., the Parthians, and it is simply misinterpreted by modern historians. If what is described in al-Tabari's work is true, and Ardashir really founded the Sassanid Empire 266 years after Alexander the Great conquered Babylon, then that means the so-called Parthian Empire never actually existed. Reading a bit further into the volume, Tabari gives the list of kings of this period. I quote, "The Persians assert that Ashok was the son of Darius. Some say he was Ashok, the son of Ashokon the Great, of the progeny of Khayabiwa, and that he reigned for 10 years. After him there ruled Ashok 21 years, Shapur 30 years, Judars the elder 10 years, Baizan 21 years, Judars the younger 19 years, Narsi 40 years, Hermuz 17 years, Ardawan the elder 12 years, Shosros 40 years, Biha Farid the Arsacid 9 years, Balash the Arsacid 24 years." End of quote. What may be interesting for us in this list of kings is that 4 kings, i.e. almost half of the list, more precisely Shapur, Narsi, Hermuz, and Ardawan, appears in the list of Sassanid rulers as well. Further reading the volume, Tabari also gives the kings list of the version which lasted for 523 years. I quote, "Others say that after Alexander, Iraq and the area between Syria and Egypt were ruled by 90 kings over 90 entities, all submitting to the ruler in al-Madain, that is, the Arsacids. Among the Arsacid rulers were Pakoros 62 years, Shapur, in whose days Christ and John the Baptist lived, 53 years, Judars, who attacked the Israelites to avenge the death of the Baptist, and whose reign lasted 59 years, Abzan, his nephew, the son of Balash, 47 years, Judhars, 31 years, his brother Narsi, 34 years, his paternal uncle Al-Hurmuzan, 48 years, his son Al-Farusan, 39 years, his son Chosros, 47 years. His son Ardawan, the last of them, was slain after a reign of 55 years by Ardashir. The reign of Alexander and of the various regional princes lasted approximately 523 years. End of the quote. The first thing that I noticed, which I already noticed earlier in another quote, is that this system of petty kings is very similar to the rule of the Seleucids. The next thing that I noticed is that the rulers in this list, generally speaking, tend to rule longer than the ones on the other list, as if someone had stretched out this time period. And the third thing is what I already said about the previous list, that there are names of Sassanid rulers who appear here as well. I haven't even mentioned that, just like with the previous list, the Parthian dynasty comes after Alexander the Great, leaving no time for the Seleucids. Another interesting date mentioned in Tabari's work is the year of the birth of Jesus. I quote, "The Persians assert that 65 years after Alexander sieged Babylonia, and 51 years after Arsacid rule began, Mary, the daughter of Imran, gave birth to Jesus. But the Christians assert that Jesus was born to her 303 years after Alexander conquered Babylonia. The reason for this is that it seems that when the Arabs wrote about the Arsacids, they actually wrote about the Seleucids and not the Parthians. And since for the Roman Christians, Jesus lived in the Parthian era, the Arabs mistakenly assumed Jesus lived in the Seleucids time period and not during the Sassanid rule, when he actually probably did. Thus, Jesus' birth year here is 250 years earlier than what we are used to. Because of all the things I have discussed here, I can say with some confidence that the people we call the Parthians never actually existed, and everything written about them is about the Sassanids. For me, the fact that in the previous Phantom Time video I speculated that the Parthians and the Sassanids were the same, while I wasn't even aware of all the things I mentioned here in this video, says to me that Heribert Illig and Toth Gyula are right, and maybe we should take the Phantom Time hypothesis very, very seriously. Anyway, that's all I wanted to talk about today. Thank you again to my Iranian guy for reaching out and helping me with this research, and thank you for watching.